Hi, my name is William Tramp, also known as This Effin' GM, and welcome to part 2 of my review of Phandelver and Below, the Shattered Obelisk. In part 1, I had talked to you about how the first half of this adventure relates to Lost Mine of Phandelver, the starter adventure from 9 years ago. If you haven't seen that review yet, you should take a look. I've put the link in the thing. But today, we're going to be talking about the second half of this adventure, where things start to get a little weird for our players. So buckle up and let's get going. Before we get started here, I want to give 2 disclaimers. Disclaimer number 1, this review is filled with spoilers. So if you don't want to know what's going to be happening throughout the course of Phandelver and Below, the Shattered Obelisk, I highly recommend watching something else, like maybe some of my shorts. Disclaimer number 2, Wizards of the Coast did send me this book for free. Now, I am under no obligation to say anything nice about it. I'm under no obligation to say anything at all, but I wanted to share my thoughts with you, and hopefully you find it valuable. Okay, now buckle in and let's get going. So what's going on in Phandalin? Well, when the heroes return from Wave Echo Cave after having defeated the Spider, they find that the small town that they are starting to call home has been overrun by vandals. Goblin vandals. Psionic goblin vandals. These psionic goblins are causing all kinds of mayhem, including ticking off the guy who leads the town by causing people to go complain to him, throwing around shingles at unsuspecting people just trying to live their lives, and stealing stones from the buildings, causing some of them to fall over. Well, it turns out the stones thing is kind of the whole point, because these psionic goblins are being told that they need to take these stones and return them to their leader. Well, the stones are actually a pretty big deal, because the stones are part of a Netherese obelisk. For those of you who have been paying attention to 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons adventures, you may note that there's a lot of Black Obelisks that pop up in these adventures. We've seen them in Prince of the Apocalypse, Tomb of Annihilation, Out of the Abyss, Storm King's Thunder, Dungeon of the Mad Mage, and my favorite, Rime of the Frost Maiden, where we are told, finally, that these aren't just strange Black Obelisks, but rather powerful Netherese artifacts capable of reality-changing magic, which is super cool. Now, I thought it was a little odd that when they were advertising this adventure, Wizards of the Coast said that this particular adventure, Phandelver and Below, the Shattered Obelisk, would finally reveal the secret of the Black Obelisk, or the Netherese Obelisk. I thought that Rime of the Frost Maiden already had, but apparently there's a little more to it. So I was super excited to finally get a solid explanation for what these obelisks are for. And in this book, they give us an explanation. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Let's get back to what's going on in this adventure. Okay, so these psionic goblins are being directed by Rixithid the Chosen, who is a psionic unicorn goblin. I say unicorn because they have a mind shard sticking out of their forehead, and it kind of looks like a weird unicorn. Anyway, so these psionic goblins are being directed by Rixithid the Chosen, and the players will eventually find themselves kicking down the doors to Rixithid's lair to confront him about why they are suggesting these goblins take these Netherese stone fragments, and the players will discover that Rixithid is nothing more than a puppet of a shadowy cabal. This will lead to more adventures, more dungeon delves. The players will find themselves in an old dwarven temple. They'll find themselves in an old drow / dwergar / Svirfneblin outpost. They'll even find themselves in an ancient crypt, all to come to the conclusion that the shadowy cabal that is directing Rixithid the Chosen and others to gather these fragments is a cabal amassed of mind flayers. These mind flayers lair deep beneath Phandalin in an old Illithid stronghold called Illithanak, and there they are planning to grab the pieces of the Black Obelisk to use its artifact reality warping powers to turn all of the people of Phandalin into, you guessed it, mind flayers. When the heroes get to Illithanak, they will soon discover that the mind flayer cabal is no longer there, But what they will find are a number of rifts that have been ripped open into the far realm. You see, these mind flayers do not follow an elder brain. They don't follow the god of mind flayers, Ilsen. No, these mind flayers follow the godlet Ilvash. Now you might wonder, what is a godlet? Well, a godlet is like a fragment of a god that has been discarded or left behind that has kind of grown into its own god-like being itself, with similar motivations to the original god, but slightly different and honestly a little more nuts. Ilvash is basically what happens when Ilsen leaves a toenail clipping in the wrong place, and that toenail clipping grows sentient and eventually decides that world domination is its thing. The heroes will then travel into the far realm itself to stop the Cabal from enacting their ritual of turning everybody that they can into mind flayers. And that's basically the idea of what the story is all about. And if you want to ask me my opinion on it, I think that's pretty darn neat. I can't remember the last time I saw an adventure actually dive into the Far Realm itself. I know in 4th edition they talked a lot about the Far Realm, and I remember reading in 3rd edition a bit about it as well, but I never saw an adventure that I can remember right now that actually dove into that realm, and that is really darn cool to me. So there you go. There's the main story of Phandelver and Below, the Shattered Obelisk, or at least the latter half of the story. Now that I've gone through that with you, I want to now move into my thoughts on this adventure. Some of these thoughts are going to be very positive. There's a lot to like in it. Some of these thoughts are going to be very not positive. There's a lot of work that I think could have been done to make this adventure more presentable at the table. I'm going to end this with discussing some suggestions that I have for you to make the campaign feel a little more robust at your table, and also maybe take some ideas of where we could go once this adventure is over. So let's go ahead and start with the positive. The first thing I love about this adventure, I've already gone through it, but it's the story. I think it's a really neat story. There's a lot of elements about it that I really think are very reminiscent of very old school D&D. And, we talked a bit before in part 1 about how I love that small town start, but I really like the fact that this kind of sticks to the small town for the majority of this adventure, because it really gives the players a sense of home and a reason to defend that which they spend most of the game defending. I think that's a very good idea. The second thing I love about this, and kind of related, is the fact that this adventure has a solid turn. I like to call that point in any adventure where the players are suddenly, let in on what's actually going on. I call that the turn. And this adventure has a very solid turn, because you're trying to keep this town safe, and everything seems to be a little odd, and you get these little sprinklings of something else going on, and then suddenly, boom, everything is flipped on its head, and you realize that there's so much more weirdness happening right underneath their noses. I love the turn. My very favorite adventures always include that moment. And in fact, really, if you think about it, this adventure has 2 turns. The first one is the revelation that mind flayers are involved in the first place. Then the second is really more of a turn for people who know a bit about how mind flayers operate, which is that these particular mind flayers, again, have nothing to do with an elder brain, but have everything to do with a fragmented godlet. I think that's neat. The third thing I really love about this adventure is the fact that mind flayers are even involved at all. Okay, so mind flayers pop up in a lot of adventures, right? So a couple of more recent examples would be like Waterdeep Dragon Eyes has Nilhor, the mind flayer dog kennel keeper who works for the Xanathar. And in Dungeon of the Mad Mage, we get a mind flayer who is dressed up as a ship captain, and it's a whole Spelljammer reference. I think that's a nice little Easter egg. But the thing is, none of those mind flayers, or a lot of others that I see pop up in adventures, are really doing mind flayer things, like trying to ensnare a populace or kind of serving as an invasion. And I love the fact that this particular adventure really leans into that. The last time that we saw a truly mind flayer focused full adventure was 1998 in Bruce Cordell's I want to call it the Ilithiad trilogy. It was since 1998. We've seen Mind Flayers pop up over and over again. We've seen books like Lords of Madness back in 3rd edition that really gave us a deep dive as to how Mind Flayers and other aberrations work, but we haven't seen a full-fledged, like, near campaign size adventure dealing with these creatures since, well, 25 years ago. It's been a while. So, hey, they're back, baby. So I love that. The fourth thing I particularly enjoy about this adventure is the very back of the book includes some DM and player tools. They've got a whole little like notebook section that's kind of intended to be scanned and then handed out to not only the players but also to the dungeon master to keep track of what's happening in the story. I think that is a nice little addition, especially since they divide it out by chapters and include little areas for what specific type of information the players and the DM should be paying attention to. I think that is a really nice move and may save a number of tables, like $20 or so, buying campaign journals. Not to say that campaign journals are a bad thing to purchase. A lot of great third-party companies out there making them, but it's nice to see this included in the official book. The next thing I love about this adventure is the amount of horror that is involved in this. There's a lot of body horror. There's a lot of cosmic horror all rolled up into this. This adventure, it starts off as your standard, bog standard, small town little adventure, but as the weirdness creeps in, so does the horror. I think one of the coolest moments I remember reading in the book was how they'll see a ghost that sort of materializes in front of them. It's a dwarf, and the dwarf pulls off its skin to reveal its skeleton underneath to show a gemstone shining beneath. And then the ghost just disappears. And I remember reading that thinking, oh, that's in there. I'm going to not sleep for at least a few more hours. Another awesome portion of this adventure, as I mentioned before, is the Far Realm. We finally get to go to the Far Realm. Now, when Wizards of the Coast has been making adventures that go to far off places, they've sort of had this little habit of creating a very tiny box that the players go to when they travel to these areas. What I mean by this is, well, let me use Dead and Thay as an example. So the adventure Dead and Thay, which appears in Tales from the Yawning Portal, we finally get an official book that says, let's go to Thay. And I've always wanted to go to Thay because Thay is awesome. But when we get there in Tales from the Yawning Portal, we're stuck in a box. We're inside of a dungeon that we cannot leave under any circumstances. And while we know that we're in Thay because, you know, the dungeon master tells us all that we're in Thay, is it really in Thay? I mean, that dungeon could be anywhere. This could be a Thay-themed dungeon that was put into, I don't know, underneath the local Chuck E. Cheese's, I guess, for adventures. I don't know. It always irritates me when we get boxed in, yet we're told we're in someplace interesting and we don't get to see the someplace interesting and we don't get to explore it. In this, it starts off that way. When we get to the Far Realm, we have a very narrow path that we can take, but the adventure explicitly calls out that once you deal with the threat, then you are able to move about the country a lot more freely. And even though, yes, any dungeon master can do that on their own, we don't need a book to tell us that we can move about the country. It is good that the designers of this game seem to at least acknowledge that before they'd sort of box us in. And I love that. I love that that we are finally seeing some acknowledgement of those, what I'm going to call bad design practices. The last thing I want to mention that I really enjoyed in this adventure is the subsystem that Wizards provided for the Far Realm's influence on Phandalin, the people of Phandalin, and the characters themselves. You see, over the course of time, every single chapter, things get a little weirder for everyone involved, and there's little tables to roll on to see how they get weirder for everybody and everything. Now, in this book, there is a sidebar that some people find controversial, in which Wizards says player consent is required. What Wizards is saying is, before you even start this adventure with your players, you should have a conversation with them to see if they are okay with their characters slowly losing their minds and slowly becoming aberrant horrors. The controversy in this is that Wizards says this is required, which Yeah, I mean, the game is made for 12-year-olds and older. I would think that we would want to instill new people with these better practices. Like, hey, let's have that conversation. This is absolutely great session zero material. Now, for those of you who find this upsetting that Wizards would dare tell you what to do, whatever. Okay, look, the book isn't written only for veteran GMs with solid groups that they've been playing with for years. The book is written also for new groups and new dungeon masters, people who've never done this before. And yeah, they're going to strongly recommend that we have these conversations at session zero. You can ignore it if you want, just like we can ignore anything in this book that we want. But me personally, before I started this game, I would have that conversation with my players. Now, it's not blah. Wow, words are hard, right? The text is not saying that we have to give up the whole goat and tell them every single thing that's gonna happen. It's just saying, hey, players, my friends, my dudes, are you cool with the idea of your players slowly becoming more aberrant over time? That's probably as far as the conversation really needs to go. And yeah, I think it's a good idea, and I think it's a neat subsystem, and that is something that I frankly will be happy to take out of this game and port into plenty of other games that I run because it's neat. All right, so there you have it. There are the positive things I found with this adventure. Now I'm going to move into some of the not so positive, the frankly negative things I found with this adventure. Now I'm not talking about piddly little things like, editing issues of names or misspellings. Who cares about those kind of things? I want to talk about issues that dungeon masters may have when presenting this to the table. The very first issue that I want to discuss is the shape of the adventure itself. A lot of the Wizards of the Coast adventures like to use a pear-shaped model where the players start off at a certain point and they have basically a whole world ahead of them. But as the adventure goes on, those choices start to narrow down as the players are kind of funneled into the main story point. This particular adventure is a lot more like a bunch of tiny pears stacked on top of one another. There's a little bit of freedom and then narrows down. A little bit of freedom narrows down. Then a little more freedom then narrows down. And we never really get the feeling like the players have a chance to breathe or to explore because they're always having to do the next thing. Okay, the second thing I want to talk about is a problem with the adventure's scope. There's a scope issue with this adventure, a couple of them actually. When we start at the beginning of the turn or the point where things start to get a little weird for Phandelver, it feels like the danger takes a step back. You see, in the very beginning of the adventure, the players have to deal with goblins who are kidnapping people. Once we hit this point, the players return to Phandelver so that they can learn they have to deal with goblins again who are causing vandalism, like, graffiti and maybe knocking over buildings, but that's not even really the point. They're just trying to take a stone, which has the unintended consequence of the buildings falling over. And that feels like a step back, especially since we've hit level 5. I remember the same thing happening back in the Shackled City Adventure Path, which was written in part by Chris Perkins. And the second adventure in there, goblins are causing vandalism to the city of Cauldron, and the players have to go and deal with it. But the thing is that it feels weird to send a group of armed mercenaries after what is effectively some teenagers causing a ruckus. This would not be a problem if the adventure had put the actual issue up front. You see, in all of that vandalism that the goblins are doing, they've also taken 14 people. Okay, 14 people have gone missing. We don't discover this until later on, which is weird. This is super weird because Phandelver has a population of 200 people. Okay, now by the time that we hit the Essentials kit, Phandelver has a population of about 1,080. And if you look it up online, what is the population of Phandelver? And I did. It says 1,080, but that's because it's assumed that time has passed and more people have come to a now thriving city. But we aren't there yet. We're still back over here where Phandelver is 60 buildings and there's maybe 200 people living in town. 14 people, nearly 10% of the population has gone missing and nobody is talking about it. Nobody is talking about it at all. And I feel that is such a better call to adventure than goblins are being really annoying, they must be destroyed. it was such a weird oversight, I feel, to leave out the townspeople talking about the missing people. I reread that portion like 4 times because I just couldn't wrap my head around it. The designers should have mentioned that much sooner. I feel that was a much bigger call to action than anything else that they have us focusing on with those goblins. My third problem is another problem with scope. And, we're on the subject of scope. I love the fact that this adventure takes place in one area for the whole time, for the most part, because we get a chance to really make it feel like home. But this game doesn't exist in a vacuum. I live in the real world, and I am fully aware that Baldur's Gate 3 exists. Baldur's Gate 3 spoilers incoming. Skip to the next one if you don't want to hear them. But in Baldur's Gate 3, we have a very similar problem, except it's on a much larger scale. Baldur's Gate, one of the biggest cities in the entire North, is having the same problem. Mind Flayers are there, and they're going to turn everyone into Mind Flayers. That's a huge problem, right? And it's something that feels like it could impact the entire world. And so why are we getting an adventure where the exact same thing is happening, but on a way, way, way smaller scale? It's not like that Baldur's Gate is higher level than this. They're the exact same level. They have the same level spread. Just, it feels like kind of a step back for those of us who played Baldur's Gate 3 before coming to this. And again, that's I know that isn't entirely the designers of this game's fault. And it is different enough in the way that the Mind Flayers are going about making others into Mind Flayers, but I really feel that this adventure maybe should have been released before Baldur's Gate 3. Granted, I also firmly believe that Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus, the previous adventure, that's what should have come out at the exact same time as Baldur's Gate 3. But that's my own personal opinion. We don't need to go into that. It's just I feel it has a problem of scope when I take other media into account, which isn't entirely fair of me, but every single one of my players has played that game, so I know it's going to come up. Okay, I want to talk about my fourth problem with this adventure. And this problem actually pops up quite a number of times throughout this adventure, but I'm going to really zero in on one particular location, the Crypt of the Talhund. Now, the Crypt of the Talhund is a dwarven crypt deep beneath one of their temples. And the Crypt of the Talhund, when I look at the map, is very, very cool. It looks awesome. Right in the middle of this little dungeon is a spinning room. And whenever a spinning room gets involved, you know things are about to get weird and wild because the players are going to probably have a puzzle to figure out. Yeah. But there's a problem with this because while the map shows a kind of a cool looking location, it's not executed very well at all. There's a lot of weird editing mistakes, and there's a problem with, again, scope. How do I explain this? First, I'll talk about the editing mistakes. So throughout the Crypt of the Talhund, there's a subsystem for haunts. All throughout the crypt, there are dwarven spirits rising up to freak the ever-living hell out of the players because of a terrible tragedy that happened here long ago. And I love that. I love that type of subsystem because it gives the players something to interact with that's not just checking for traps. And in this area, in the crypt, if the players deal with these haunts, then they don't have to deal with some of the bigger threats in the dungeon because the threats will be calmed down, because a lot of the monsters that are rising up inside of the crypt are rising up because there's this unfinished business. So that's cool. That's super cool. That's some classic stuff right there. But whoever designed this didn't go over to make sure that it all mashes up. A prime example I have is there's this room where there's a mummy inside of it, right? And just outside of that room, there's a haunt. And each haunt, there's a number of haunts in there. Each haunt has a different way to release the spirits there, and it tells you exactly what you need to do. So in this particular case, the mummy room and just outside, the haunt says to get rid of it, you must defeat the mummy inside the room. Okay, well, the mummy turns out is one of those creatures that are affected by the haunt, and the mummy says, the stat point for the mummy, or the little area for the mummy says, if you deal with the haunt outside, you don't have to the mummy will not rise. Okay, so if I deal with the mummy, there is no haunt. but if I deal with the hunt, there is no mummy. What do I do? You're going to have to fight the mummy. There's no way around it. So any players who are excited about dealing with some of these threats outside the box, eventually they're going to hit a wall, and that's a wall. Another issue is there's this with kind of the design notes. There's this weird thing where the book continues to push you in this dungeon towards getting treasure in the form of gemstones that are hidden inside of the dwarves' like skeletal cavity, which is where I got that really cool haunt with the skin pulling back. I love that. But it turns out that as long as players don't take the gemstones from the chest, then they get a boon from the dwarven god. But not in every case. Some gemstones are okay to take, some are not, and there's no way to know which ones are which for the players. They're just gonna, eventually they're just gonna pick up one gemstone and then be slapped in the face and told, ha ha ha, sucker, you've desecrated this place. And that kind of feels like a screw job. I feel like there should have been a bit more attention paid to making sure that kind of stuff doesn't happen. I'm not saying it should be fully obvious, but there could have been at least some hints that point towards what is and what is not okay. Speaking of the map, there is this, if we go to the top level, right, the top level map for the actual temple, there's this giant staircase that's been caved in, kind of giving everybody an indicator that something horrible has happened, but also something is down below. And part of what you have to do in the temple above is you have to find the secret way down into this crypt, because the easy way in, the big staircase, is gone. But if we look at the map for the Crypt of the Talhund, or the Crypt of the Talhund, those stairs don't exist. They were never there in the first place, so that kind of broke it for me, because usually I don't notice these things. I know there are people who very much notice these things. Usually I don't. I kind of miss these little connections, but I did notice it in this case because the staircase is massive. It's so big. How could you not miss it? Well, it's apparently whoever made this map, it was Mike Schley, and Mike Schley is awesome. I don't know if you got the wrong direction. I don't know if you missed it, but there's no staircase. That threw me off a little bit. All right, the last issue with the Crypt of the Talhund, and this, again, these are problems that kind of pop up in other portions of the adventure, but this one is really where I saw it, right? The last problem I have with the Crypt of the Talhund is the final boss battle. So I mentioned that spinning room with the puzzle that you have to figure out to get into it, right? And there's definitely a puzzle to figure out. And the problem is that there's really nothing in that room that matters. There's nothing in that room that matters at all, other than the coolest fight in the entire dungeon, where you get to face 3 vengeful wraiths who are kind of floating around this big old crystal. I don't know if you can see this, but it's really cool. It's a really cool battle. It's so cool, in fact, that they commissioned art for it. But there's no reason to have the fight. That giant crystal isn't worth any money. There isn't any treasure actually in that room at all. And those 3 wraiths have nothing to do with the overall crypt. You don't need to do it. It's not the boss battle. It's not anything. It's something to make a sphere of emblem that you find happy, which, okay, you can do that and you can not. I don't know. That's up to you. But there's really no point for it, and that felt like a big letdown. In fact, the entire boss battle is really happening in a storeroom. The entire room is literally nothing but this giant room with one abandoned mining cart, and in the abandoned mining cart is the fragment of the obelisk. It's like, it's such a letdown. It's like, yeah, let's fight in a storeroom, right? Or they're like, hey, let's give a big boss battle area that makes it's big. It's gonna have enough space for all of these ghosts that are gonna come streaming out of the walls, which there are a lot of ghosts streaming out of the walls. That's cool. But it's featureless. There's nothing going on. It's just, here's a room, here's a mining cart, and here it goes. Okay, sure, I guess. I don't know. It was a bit disappointing. Okay, I want to talk about my last problem with this book, and this is something that really isn't a problem with the adventure itself. The problem is the implied promise of the adventure. Now, Wizards of the Coast had, in their marketing for this, kind of implied that we were going to finally discover the secret of the Netherese obelisk, which is super awesome for me. This was absolutely a selling point. Okay, I know I got the book for free, but I was totally going to buy this book on day one anyway, because I wanted to know the secret of the obelisk. I've been playing these adventures for 9 years, and I've played through every single one of those adventures I mentioned before that had the Black Obelisk in there. I've been reading up on blogs. I've been watching YouTube videos, all trying to come up with a theory of what these Black Obelisks are all about. And Rime of the Frost Maiden, one of the things I loved about Rime of the Frost Maiden is that they explained what their Netherese obelisk does, which is it's basically a giant reset button, right, for the entire world. It's phenomenal. That's magic that is so far beyond what the players have the capability of doing. It is just so cool. But when they released this book, they finally told us exactly what these obelisks are. They actually are copies, right? The Netherese didn't create this magic. It was by the Spellweavers, which, again, as somebody who's played the Shackled City, I know the Spellweavers. That's some deep lore. I love it. But they explained that these obelisks are really just like knockoff copies created by the Netherese, and they all have different powers, but they don't define any of them. The only obelisk that has truly defined purpose and power is the one in Rime of the Frost Maiden. This book just straight up says, hey, they're MacGuffins, right? Okay, they do whatever you need them to do at whatever time you need them to do for whatever story fits for you. Which is okay, I guess, but I kind of feel like if you're going to create a giant magical artifact for that, I want to see some rules. I want to see some hard, fast, this is how it works. If it's do whatever you want, fun fact, I already had that ability. I've always had that ability as a dungeon master. Heck, your dungeon master's guide even tells me I can pretty much do what I want. That was a letdown. That was a huge letdown. I'm not going to say I've wasted the past 9 years, because that's hyperbolic, but I kind of feel like I invested a little tiny piece of my dungeon master self and my lore loving self, and that part of me that really likes finally seeing the end of a story. And when I reach the end, the door has been opened and there's just a guy with a Hasbro shirt on who says the real mystery were the friends you made along the way. I'm like, okay, thanks and bye. Yeah, I don't know. Boy, I'm really disappointed about that. Okay, anyway, let's move on. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about in my review are some suggestions that I have that I think will make this adventure a lot better. And not to say that it won't work as is, it will, but here are some suggestions I have for you to really drive it home at the players that this is going to be a thing. The first thing I would do is I would add in some downtime. This is often a problem in Wizards of the Coast adventures, in that they don't give the players a lot of room to breathe, to spend their money, to enjoy their bases, to do things that they want to pursue. So what I would do is, after the players defeat the spider in Wave Echo Cave and they go back to Phandelver, I would give a couple of weeks or months of just downtime. And I would let the players use that time how they wish, but I would also give them a base. Now, the adventure does give the players a base at a little bit later in the adventure, where they give them basically a studio apartment in the ground, which is, yeah, okay, whatever. I think we should all take a page. I think we should take a page out of Acquisitions Incorporated, which has a Phandelver adventure in here. I think we should take a page out of that book and just give them the Red Brand Mansion. That should be their base. I think that would work out really well. So I would put in some downtime, but give them that base as a reward for taking down the spider, and then let them build that up into something that they want. And I think that that'll really help the players feel that Phandelver is really theirs. Much better than some random studio apartment in the ground. Oh, that's such a, sorry, that's I don't know why I keep laughing about that, but it felt really small. I mean, I played through Waterdeep Dragon Heist. I'm doing that right now in an actual play, which you can watch somewhere on my channel. And we're doing a kind of a remix of Dragon Heist right here, Dragon Heist. And in chapter 2, the players get a base, right? The Wizards knew that people liked bases. They knew that players wanted a base, and so they gave them one right off the bat. And then they kind of stopped giving out bases, which kind of sucked. And then now they're giving a base again, but it's a studio apartment in the ground. So anyway, whatever. Okay, I would do those things. The next suggestion that I would have is I would use books like Acquisitions Incorporated, and especially use the Essentials Kit. The Essentials Kit expands on Phandelver and the surrounding areas, and adds a lot more site-based locations and things to happen. So I would use the Essentials Kit to expand on the area. Now, I know that the Essentials Kit is kind of set into the future, but you can ignore all that part, especially since a lot of those locations are, well, old, right? So you can put those in now. You don't have to wait until 5 years in the future to do this. Plus, if you haven't noticed, the Essentials Kit has a dragon on the front of it. There's a frickin' dragon who you had to fight on top of a tower. Okay, that's actually familiar. We did that with the green one too. Whatever. I don't care. I love more dragons, and I love more options. So expand a little, give the players a little room to go and explore other things, and still get treasure for it, and also have the storyline going too. I think that'll really help things out. The last thing I would mention is you know, the last portion of the book, it gives us our classic wizard's model of, hey, here's where you can take the campaign after this. And I have a couple of ideas I thought might be kind of fun to add in there. I think that the goblet that I mentioned before should maybe kind of ramp things up in Revenge to the players. I think maybe you could move to Neverwinter, which is nearby and technically speaking where the players actually start this entire adventure. I think that maybe that we could bring in Planescape to this, because the god that Ilvash is a fragment of, Ilsensin, is living in the outlands of Planescape. And I think that would be a great place to take your players to, maybe to enlist Ilsensin to help defeat its, you know, sentient toenail. I think that'd be a cool way to expand upon this. So these are just some ideas that I had. I don't know, take them or leave them, but yeah, that's it. Okay, well, that is the end. That is my review, my very first review of anything ever, but my review of Phandelver and Below, the Shattered Obelisk. Again, there's a lot to love in this adventure. There are some pretty solid notes that get hit. I can definitely see running this whole thing at my table, but there's going to be some work that needs to be put in before it's ready to be presented to my players. So keep that in mind. You know, hopefully that doesn't detract from you getting curious about what the adventure may do for your players. But, you know, hopefully my advice has helped you to be able to run a better game. I look forward to seeing you all next time with my next review. I still haven't chosen what that's going to be yet. Until then, feel free to subscribe to my channel. Check out my Want to Be a Better Dungeon Master videos, or maybe some of my shorts. I got a lot of stuff going on here. So thanks for watching, and I hope to see you all soon.